Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to talk to people who already value native plants, so I don't have to start with why those are important. I'm just going to share our farm and what we've been doing for the last 30 years or so. Um, I have a presentation to share with you so you guys can see what we're doing. So St. Isidore Farm is kind of the latest evolution of the family farm that I grew up on. Can everyone see it? Is it working? Oh, okay, good. All right. Um, we are a farming family for as far back as we can trace our family's history in this country. My dad grew up as a fourth generation farmer on a ranch in northern Wyoming before he kind of fell in love with Alaska as a young man and came up to UAF and met my mom, and they started our family together. And for a long time, they weren't farming, and it wasn't until really the mid 80s that he finally found a piece of land and also the right crops. He grew up on a very traditional ranch, cows, sheep, corn. That's not an easy thing to do in Alaska. And so after a lot of research, he found that growing Alaska native grasses was going to be the way to go for us. Um, and so as a young kid, he took us out to see our farm, which is down the Eielson Farm Road, if you guys are familiar with the interior, um, just southeast of North Pole. And as kids in the car, we were waiting to see, a farm, at least some fields, and it was all trees. It was just the classic Alaskan woods. And we started like that and cleared it, picked sticks, and started from the very beginning to see what it really is like to start a farm without the head start that we had always seen going back to my grandparents' ranch in Wyoming. Um, but it was a beautiful way of life, and we grew up doing that solely as a family, all working together. And I wanted my children to have that. So as we got older and started to think about what that might look like after I started a family, I kept going back to things that my dad used to talk about and some of the crops that he wished he could do. Our project was big enough on its own. Both of my parents had other jobs, so farming was always our side gig. Um, but this is what St. Isidore Farm looks like pretty much today. Um, we have a homestead that we've cleared, and we farm about 50 acres, between 50 and 60 acres of native grasses and wildflower. We started out primarily farming 3 different varieties of grass seed. This is some of our flower field as well, so you can just see. I just wanted you to see the scope of the fields and the different varieties that we have. That's Jacob's Ladder. I was showing you some of my chamomile before. So the farm is really just a labor of love for our family, and it's always been about keeping Alaska beautiful and the way that Alaska is uniquely beautiful on its own instead of introducing new species to it. When my dad began growing grasses, um, he really had to educate people about how these grasses would be valuable for re-veg rather than using introduced species. And I feel like that's what we're doing right now with our flowers. We're kind of reliving the same project over again to try to convince people that they're worth the extra effort, they're worth the work, and that ultimately they provide a great deal more benefits to the natural habitat. That's some of our columbine. This project, began by trying to grow just 4 varieties in 2017, and now it's expanded to, we have more than a dozen that are either in production or in development. So we started with our native grasses, blue joint, Beckmania. Here's our first blue joint field. It's still producing. This was planted in 1988. It still produces beautiful seed for us. So that's the other beauty of this. It's no-till farming where it just all of our I should say most of our grasses are completely perennial. We do have some, our alpine grass, we do turn fields over after a few years. This is alpine bluegrass, the Poa alpina. We've also been growing this since 1988. But these fields do turn over every 3 years. So these are the 4 varieties that we started with. Jacob's ladder, oxytropis, or white oxytrope is what we call it. It's its common name. I call the lower left-hand corner, I call it wild potato. I grew up calling it Eskimo potato. I feel like, we try to use the term that's most respectful to people. It's Adicera alpinum, for those of you who recognize that. And then Arctic lupin. And these were the flowers that my dad had talked about growing over and over again when I was a kid, and just he never had time to invest in developing what it would take to produce these flowers. So it was always, we would always go back to the grass, but it was always in my head that perhaps we could do this. And so when I finally came back to the farm with my own children, that was my first ambition, was that we would expand and with more help be able to do flowers. The first, I'll go back to this one because the first seed we did get primarily from the PMC. We didn't know yet about wild collecting, and we wanted to make sure that we had things that were exactly what we thought they were, because that is a problem that we run into over and over and again in the seed business, is people selling things that are not in fact true natives, selling things that they don't really understand what they are. And that's something that we care very deeply about, that we make sure we're selling things that have been correctly identified and cultivated in a way that is respectful to the land. So this is this is our Arctic chamomile, which also the original seed came from the PMC, as did the Western columbine that you see on the right. Those are 2 that we developed as we started to try to get larger crops that would be suitable for re-veg. It's very difficult to produce large quantities of grass seed, or flower seed, I should say, and you'll see why shortly. I'll show you our process, just to maintain the purity and to keep it growing. It's quite challenging. So these are 2 crops that have done well for us. We do some wild collecting. My original alpine arnica came from wild collection around Fairbanks and North Pole, and then our iris as well. And some of our plants we found just don't respond well to being grown in a field, being fertilized or being cultivated that way. So we continue to just wild collect, as such, which our fireweed is a good example of that. I have some Nootka lupin that I collected around Anchorage and in Southeast. And then we've also wild collected some wild plantain. I have very small amounts of dwarf fireweed. So just lots of little things that we continue to look everywhere. So I have some wild geranium that I'm still trying to figure out how to make it grow and be happy in a more commercial environment. Sometimes it just doesn't work out, and we just have to keep wild collecting it to maintain our supply. So when we start planting, this is my daughter. When we start planting, we've gone to growing almost primarily from starts, which is really labor intensive, but we found it's the best way to get healthy plants into the field and then keep the winter kill to an absolute minimum. Fall planting works as well. We have to fight the weeds so hard with any kind of direct seeding. So for a big field, if you're going to have to hand weed a huge field, the best way we found to do it is to start our plants. It's also how we test all of our seed. I've had some really bad experiences in the seed businesses of buying things that were misidentified or that weren't good seed, that maybe weren't stored well. And so I don't ever sell anything that we haven't grown ourselves or had independently tested at the PMC. So we plant a lot of starts, both to expand our own fields and to test what we've grown to make sure that it meets our quality standards, which is really labor intensive. So we put them in the trays, and then they live on our on our porch and in our sunroom for, depending on the variety, for anywhere from 4 to 6, sometimes 7 weeks, 8 weeks even. We bottom water in the start. These are some of the resources we have on our site. One of our things that we really want to do is try to help people know how to grow this stuff if they haven't ever worked with native seeds. If they're new to growing plants at all, people seem to be really intimidated by growing from seed often, and growing plants that they may not have heard of, even though they've probably seen them around. So we do our best to try to help people get started in that process. This is some of our spring work on the farm. We constantly are fighting weeds. So this is rototilling some of our alpine fields, and it's a way to deal with weeds that doesn't involve a chemical, to keep the weeds out of the corrugation, so that we can also flood irrigate, which is something else that we depend on, especially in our more arid summers when we're looking for really good seed production, to keep everything going. When we prepare our seed beds for planting, again, we have to just make sure it's completely clean, especially for any kind of flower. I'm preparing a seed bed right here for one of our flower plots. So it has to be absolutely clean of any weeds, because they don't compete well. And they, especially with other grasses, they'll choke out easily. So we spend a lot of time just trying to make sure that everything is as clean as we possibly can get it before we put anything in the ground. And then with some varieties, we can use seeding, like this is a brilliant, this is a direct seeder. So we can sometimes do things like that, but we are often still using techniques that are as old as farming itself. So these are my boys planting some blue joint on a row that had not done well by hand. You'll see here, they can plant blue joint, but they haven't quite figured out how to high five. They're working on it. So sometimes it's still that old fashioned, and that's what gets it done. And then once we've got our starts established, we hand plant them in the field. Again, extremely labor intensive, but it works. And so we keep doing it. Once we have a plant that's established, it just does a lot better when we're trying to weed around it or keep it, just keep it free of being contaminated. So much of our business depends on the seed not having weed seed in it, or any other type of flower. So we have to make sure that we have exactly what we say we do. A big challenge is always to get good seed production. We have to keep things watered. So we use a mixture of flood irrigation with a variety of other techniques. We hand water some things. I'll show you in just a minute. We have a gun stand that we use occasionally. Most of our grasses are flood irrigated for the most part. And because they're native grasses, I don't think they depend on water nearly as much as some other crops would, but we do definitely still have to worry about water. So this is our chamomile that definitely soaks up the water when it gets hot. And then I'm watering, that's a video of our nursery where I start any of our new flower crops. We start by just trying them out in about 40 feet to see if they like the farm, to see how they respond, to learn about them. And then if they do well in the nursery, they'll move into our larger 2-acre production field for flowers. This is the gun stand that we use sometimes when we're starting it's just like a really huge sprinkler. When we're trying to start a seedling crop, just trying to give you a sense of, there are so many different strategies that are required to get native plants to do what we want them to do. They don't play by the same rules as plants that have been genetically modified and built for farming. We spend so much time weeding and weeding by hand because we don't use herbicides or pesticides on the flowers. So there's just a lot of time spent in a field with a bucket and crawling down rows, keeping things cleaned up, not getting too far behind. Some of them are obviously easier. The chamomile is a pretty vigorous plant. Others definitely take a lot more care. One thing that people often don't imagine when we talk about growing these plants is that every single one of them, whether it's our grass seed or our flowers, have required that we learn how to harvest them. You know, just figuring out how to grow them is enough of a challenge often. The next thing that we have to do is once they've come out of the earth, we have to figure out how to get them off of the plant. And every single variety we have requires specialized equipment to do that. This is a seed stripper. It was developed in Oklahoma when CRPs became more kind of prevalent in that area. So it is built for stripping seed off of prairie grasses. And we've used this with great success to harvest our blue joint from the very beginning. This one did not require a great deal of modification because it's one of the few pieces of equipment that was actually developed to do something similar to this. Once we get it off into the stripper, we put it into a trailer. And I'll show you why in just a minute. Because as soon as you harvest seed, you need to be concerned about keeping it dry and cool as much as you can. So we get it in the wagon and get going pretty quickly. So this is a combine that, if you've been around farming at all, you know combines are usually meant for things like corn, but my dad modified it a lot, and now it harvests alpine. So it pulls it into the hopper with those big paddles. And then we slowly push it back out into a trailer. You can see there. Kids love Combine Day. It's always fun to get all the seed off the field. Everybody's always happy, usually if it's going well, unless we break something, because it means that we've had another successful harvest. This is another tool that we had to play around with flower seed. Was a particular challenge. And how do we harvest this stuff? What are we going to do? How can we make it so that it's not so labor intensive? Some of our seed is still hand harvested, but some of it we've been able to find ways, like with a vacuum. We tried it on the Isidore and it didn't work. But we do still vacuum our arnica. And we have some other asters that I think we might ultimately use. But again, we had to modify it. That's not just, I mean, it is a weed blower, but we had to modify it to make it work and not damage the seed. So there's always a lot of work on that end before we ultimately make something. I wanted to show you an evolution of how some of our machines have been invented. So this was the very first little tiny row of Jacob's ladder I had my first year. And my dad had built me this. It's meant to be like a small combine. It has the same wheel on the front. And then that's a weed trimmer that he's mounted on it to this wagon. And as you can see, it's not working amazing. Like, we figured out right away, okay, that's not going to work. So then what do we do next, right? So we took the wheel off and we tried it with somebody standing in front of it with with a rake. And you'll see I try to rake everything in to get the Isidore into the wagon, which is still not a terribly efficient way to do this. So we decided quickly that that was not going to work on a large scale either. So the next thing we did was launch. My dad built a header and put it on his loader. And so now this is what we use when we harvest some of our larger lots of flowers, including the Jacob's ladder, which is now in the flower field along with the chamomile and the columbine. So here we are harvesting our chamomile. So you can see what that looks like with the header, and then dumping it into our trailer where we'll dry it. And then we get to deal with our next problem after we have some young farmers help us stomp it down. Our next problem is, okay, so we have to dry it, which we do everything from leaving it out in the sun if that cooperates. This is some of our wild collected iris, to heat mats on tables with trays for smaller lots. But for bigger things, we need dryers. Like this is what we do for our alpine and larger grass lots. This is actually a peanut dryer that my dad somehow found at an auction and modified again, so that it will attach to our wagon and dry the grass seed, so that we don't have any risk of moisture getting in there and then fungus that can grow and destroy our seeds. So we get it dry quickly, and then we can get it on the floor and start to worry about all the other issues that we have to worry about. Once we've figured out how to grow it and figured out how to harvest it, now we have to figure out how to clean it. And again, the flowers were way harder than even the grass. With some of our early stuff, we would try this. This is a chipper. We were trying to thrash it to get the stems off of it. And then this is a seed cleaner from the 50s, a David Bradley seed cleaner that we use to try to get the chaff and a lot of the light seed out of the good stuff. Sometimes we still use our hands and a screen. It's sometimes the best way still. This is one of our, I think, more higher tech, I guess I would say. This is a thrasher where we can run, this is chamomile. We're running chamomile through the thrasher and then getting some of the trash out of it, making sure that there isn't any good seed in there. And the good seed goes down there, separated and fairly clean. And then this is an air column. So this works by letting the good seed, the heavy seed, falls into the bucket, the light seed and the chaff comes over here. We've used that with some of our smaller lots. Again, takes a lot of modification and a lot of experimentation to make sure that works well. So every single variety has its own special protocol, and some of them we're still working on to try to make them faster, make them better. And if you're willing to do all that, you can end up with a packet of seed, which took, for our first packets, it took us over 3 years just to get to that place where we felt confident with our product, confident that we were selling the correct things. We have depended on scientists. We've had some wonderful scientists come out and make sure that what we're growing is what we say we're growing. I've had 2 different seed companies sell me seed, for example, that they sold as Myasota salpestris, which was in fact the Sylvatica. It blows me away that people will just do that. We do have one variety on our site that is, I just call it a larkspur because it is a hybrid. We learned the hard way to make sure that we kept anything that was true native away from hybrids, away from anything that could cross-pollinate, because it infected the entire crop. And so now we've removed all of those. I still sell the seed to people who are interested in a nice perennial that's a beautiful plant and that is consistently perennial, even in the interior. But it's not a true native. We've pulled out all of those plants and restarted with wild collected Delphinium glaucum. And we will, after we finish selling the seed, we won't sell any more of the hybrid. Our goal really is to be 100% native. One of the other fun things that we do is we have all this straw that comes from growing the blue joint and the alpine. Once we've collected the seed, we mow it and then we bale the straw. And for years, the straw was just kind of a fun thing for kids and grandkids to play on. And we couldn't really figure out what to do with it. And then about 10 years ago, my dad started a compost business. And so the first year we just leave the bales to just weather in the winter. And then these are second year bales. So this has already gone through winter. Then we cut the string, we put them in a big tub grinder and add some water. So it's just straw and water. And then we let them sit in big windrows. Um, this will, you can see my son trying to keep it in a windrow there underneath all of it. This will sit for another year and then another year after that. So it takes 3 years to make our compost. But in the end, we get this nice pile of really beautiful, really effective compost. We use it a lot on our flowers, but we also do sell it. So a lot of gardeners in our area will come out and buy a big bag from us. And a lot of the peony growers around our farm use it to great effect. We bag it ourselves as well. So everything is done on the farm. Everything is done by a family member. Even our flower labels were created by a cousin of ours who's an artist. So it is a true family farm of 3 generations farming together and trying to keep this way of life alive. Hopefully so that my children will someday be able to decide how they want to farm and if they want to continue doing it. So that's St. Isidore Farm. And I should say it's St. Isidore, that's the patron saint of farmers. So that's why we named it St. Isidore Farm. But I'm certainly open to any questions or anything you might want to know if I left anything out.
I just want to say that was a really wonderful virtual tour. You had video for every point in the process, if you felt like. So that was just great. Thank you.
I hope it helped. I know a lot of these machines are unfamiliar to people who haven't been around farming, so we wanted to try to give as much of a idea of what we do and what it looks like.
Wonderfully made presentation.
Thanks.
Yeah, if anybody has questions for Sarah, please um please put it in the chat, or actually Sarah may not be able to see that yet because of the slides, but there is a question from
Oh.
Beth asking, how can we buy your seed?
Oh, we sell through our website. So stisidorefarmak.com, which is on here right now. If you're in Anchorage, Alaska Mill sells a lot of our seed. They don't have everything, but they have most of our varieties. If you're a true lover of native plants, you might be interested in some of the varieties we have on the site that that they might not find as marketable in the store. So I would encourage you to also check the website or email me through the website, and I'm always happy to talk about native plants or flowers anytime. And then in Fairbanks, they're sold at Hawks Greenhouse in North Pole. Again, not everything. If you want to, just run down and get something, but we have a store on our site that has everything that we have available, including larger quantities.
I think you answered it, but Pat did ask about how you decided on the name. If there's more to the story than patron saint.
Well, we need our patron saint of farming almost every day. Something breaks, something happens. So yeah, that's part of our heritage as well. And my kids kind of came up with that. They thought that would be the best name. My dad never had a name for it. It was always just kind of our family farm. But I found that when I got into the business, people kept asking me what the name was. And then when I looked around, other farms had names now, and that wasn't really the way I remembered it as a kid. So we decided to have our Saint Isidore.
There's another question in the chat. When you weed, is there a particular weed that shows up and causes a problem, or is it mostly just neighboring plants that aren't your target species?
It really depends on where we are in the farm. So with the grasses, we even have to hand weed the grasses at this point because the fields are so much older, especially the blue joint fields. So we watch for polar grass, we watch for any kind of rogue grasses because those are really the only things that compete. my dad has long called dandelions the yellow scourge because we just fight them all the time, constantly. And we definitely deal with a lot of equisetum. Some people call that pineapple weed. We deal with a lot of chickweed, So really in the flowers, they don't compete well with almost any of that. Like you have to really fight a lot. In the grasses, it's mostly other grasses and dandelions that you're fighting.
And Pat asks, what kind of future plans you have for wildflower?
Well, we're
operation?
really hoping to, we've had some re-veg work, but I would really like to see pollinators be included in a lot more of the re-veg mixes that happen around. And I still see plenty of re-veg happening even in our community in Fairbanks and around North Pole that's using red fescue or other things that aren't native. So I just think it's a lost opportunity, a really lost opportunity. And so we I understand, and my dad certainly went through this when he started his seed business, that part of it is convincing decision makers that we are going to be a consistent source and that they can depend on the source and we can consistently produce a volume that is necessary to add into these mixes. There is also some challenges there that you can't just put wildflower seed into hydroseeder. It's not going to work. You have to either grow starts out or create little plots where you are really intentional about where you put the wildflower seed. So I'm hoping that we can make more inroads into the re-veg market, but I also just want to educate more Alaskans about how much these plants can benefit their own lawns. I mean, even just planting a few of them. We've planted them in boxes and overwintered them and had them on our deck as well. And they are covered in bees and butterflies all year. I mean, the difference between the pollinators on these plants versus some of the other, and my mom still has some vegetables and things. It just was extraordinary. And when we're in the field with the plants, the buzzing of insects is just constant. It's so noticeable how much more they attract pollinators than non-native plants.
Now, I was curious, Sarah, if you have had a plant that you really wanted to grow that you tried and just could not figure out how to make it work.
Well, I've had a couple of those because the first four were all my dad's kind of plant. As a little kid, I just had a love of the bluebells. I loved them. I just remembered finding them everywhere. Bluebells and the wild rose. I thought those were my favorite, little kid flowers. And neither, and I would also say dwarf dogwood because I could not, I think it's probably more rhizonomous than it is a seed plant. So trying to get those, we've tried all of those. I've played around with the seeds and, it takes so much time to gather them, and then you try to plant them and you try different methods to dry the seed and all kinds of things. We've played around with rock tumblers. We've played around with hydrochloric acid, even with the scarification process. That's another thing, that when you buy our seed, it is actually ready to plant. It doesn't need to be scarified. Often when you look at wildflower seed for sale, they ask for you to do some of your own scarification. And we just thought that was probably not feasible for most people, and especially for people who are just beginning to grow plants. And I wanted it to be accessible. So we do our own cold scarification, which means that we harvest in the fall, and then I scarify it and test it in the winter and spring. And then I sell those seeds. So they're ready to be planted from the packet, that you don't have to do anything else. Excuse me. So that mattered to me after all of my fighting with some of those varieties that I just really, really wanted to grow. Right now, I'm still struggling with, I really think we can figure geranium out, but it's been a process to get the the level of germ that I feel is necessary. I won't sell anything that doesn't have at least a 70% germ rate. I don't want people, working with seed and only getting half of it to come up. I think that would be really demoralizing and kind of it would feel unethical for me to sell something like that. So sometimes I can get it to germinate and grow, but not at a rate that I feel comfortable selling to someone and saying this is, the seed is good seed that you can definitely get some plants out of. So I'm still fighting the geranium because I think it's a beautiful plant and I would love to be able to grow it. And I'm still looking for a good source for Myosotis alpestris for our forget-me-not, which was the flower my husband and I used in our wedding, and we love that flower. But it's a really difficult flower to find in the wild, and it's really commonly sold as alpestris when it's in fact sylvatica, which is not native and a very different plant. Actually, if you look at it, it looks quite different.
There's a question from Beth, and Beth, you might want to repeat it, but Sarah, she was asking if your plants are changing at all through hybridization.
We definitely notice. I mean, we learned a hard lesson with our delphinium, where I had wild collected it, and some of it was delphinium glaucum, but then some of it definitely was not. And I didn't know the plant well enough to recognize that. And one of the many scientists that have been kind enough to really share their expertise with us, Pat Holloway, was out on the farm, and she said, that is not glaucum. And when we looked at it, and then I looked back at old pictures, I could see over the years the progression of how that had happened. So I would just say that we make sure that our seed, that when we get it, it is what we think it is. And then that's part of why I kind of isolate it in the field and it's out away from other things. I mean, there's things like arnica, there's three, at least I use Werner Pratt's book. That was a lot of how I educated myself. I mean, you could hear in my bio, I'm not a botanist, I'm a farmer, and I grew up farming. That's how I learned about it. So other than reading and my father spent many years researching, and also the work of Dick Baldwin, who sold wildflower seeds for many, many years. We're very indebted to Dick's work, and he wrote a book as well. But there's things like arnica, where there's 3 varieties at least that are well documented, and there's one that is much more common in Fairbanks. But I tried to look at what I was collecting carefully before it went to seed. I would scout my plants and be like, okay, I don't really want the nodding one, I don't want the frigid, I wanted the alpine arnica. So we do that. So I haven't, we're into our 7th year. I haven't seen, other than the delphinium, I haven't seen a huge problem with that. The variety of, like, the color variety in the Jacob's ladder, for example, where you occasionally get a white one, but mostly they're that kind of lavender to darker lavender. That stayed pretty consistent. The columbine has stayed incredibly consistent. I haven't had any issues there. But we watch for that because we've learned the hard way that sometimes we're going to have to give up a whole crop if that happens.
Thank you. Allison asks if scarifying seed reduces its shelf life.
I have not had that problem. I mean, again, the oldest seed, I have some seed, and I keep it because, I'm trying to keep learning from it. So I do have some seed from our earliest years, and I still can plant it and get good germination. It hasn't for the variety, and I always say it hasn't for the varieties that I've tried so far. There are no rules with wild plants, and they surprise us all the time. Even the grasses that my dad has been growing for 35 years, they change, and as our climate is changing, they are changing. Many of the things that we did in the beginning in our first 5 to 10 years of farming don't work anymore. I farmed with my dad through about the time I was about 20, and then that's when I left for college. And I still came back to the farm every year, but I wasn't really working with him until about 15 years later, and that's when I brought my kids back. And I was shocked at how much had changed. And he really felt like it was because of warmer winters and because of the changes he had seen um, in our climate. So things are constantly changing. Right now, I have not had that problem, but it could just be because of the varieties that I've tried it with this so far. It also could be because I'm currently only using cold scarification, so I'm letting it go through freeze thaw. I'm not using anything chemical. I'm not scraping it. I think those harsher scarifications um, might affect how long seed is viable. I mean, it is a living thing. And that may be part of some of the seeds that I have not had success with because I'm not using those stronger scarifications or more extreme scarifications. That may be part of why it's not working, but I'm not sure.
That's a good segue into the next question in our chat, which was if you could explain scarification and perhaps your cold scarification too, since I might not be that familiar with that one.
Well, scarification just means that when seed is dropped from a plant, it often has a coating on it that makes it take longer to germinate. And nature does that because nature's smart, right? If everything germinates right away, and then there's some sort of catastrophic event, then a certain species could be wiped out. So it's good in nature to have it have this lower germ rate, and some seeds will go into a really deep state of and take years before they're ready to germinate. Obviously, if you're doing this in a commercial level, you don't want that to happen. So most seed that's sold, unless it's genetically modified, which a lot of it is going to have to be scarified on some level, but wild seed is going to have to go through some kind of process. We in the beginning with those first 4 varieties we tried, as I mentioned before, we used a rock tumbler. My dad and I had a couple of scary afternoons playing around with hydrochloric acid, which I don't recommend on any level. Anyone trying? We made it, but that had been recommended to us by someone else, and it did not work. In addition to being kind of dangerous, it did not work. It's in the end what I wanted to try and what worked for us was to imitate nature, which is to have it, these seeds would fall and then go through the freeze thaw cycles that they would go through in a typical winter as we start to go through fall and then deep winter. And so I started by just letting them do that, in keeping them dry in a connex, but leaving them to go through those temperature changes. And ultimately that worked for the varieties that we were working with. That being said, it works with the varieties that we're working with after they've been taken care of the way we take care of them, watered and babied. And if you just went and wild collected seed, it won't work with every type of seed that you have. And it also, the cleaning matters a lot too, like how much can you get off of it. So if you saw, like the Isidore alpinum has those, they look like little pea things that hang down. You have to get that off of it. I mean, I've planted it with those on, and you do get some germ. That's fine. I mean, they will germinate to some degree. But if you take that off, and we use a brush machine for that, or you thrash it somehow, then you're going to have a much better rate of germ on that seed. So there's so many factors that come into making seed work. And so we're very, I mean, you almost get just paranoid about doing everything exactly the same way once you finally found a protocol that works.
Well, I had another question about about stratification, and then when you're doing your testing. And I was mostly curious if you have to cold stratify everything. I assume you have a pretty short window of time where you're doing your testing. Like how long are you usually doing that?
So you saw my daughter, we start usually in early May, and I plant a flat, at least a flat. Usually, often I'm also using that as an opportunity to expand, how much of that I have in the field. or, replace plants that have been damaged or winter killed. So all of our plants are perennial, but as with all things, sometimes things die, Last year I had ravens dig up half of my oxytropis for no apparent reason. So we'll be planting a lot of oxytropis starts this spring. I don't know. But that process, again, depending on the variety, but everything, I can see how much it's going to germinate within 2 to 3 weeks usually. So they're little, but I can still see that that's good seed that came up, and they won't be ready to go in the field. We have to take them out for a short time for those of you who have grown from starts, that you have to slowly acclimatize them before you put them in a field. And so between doing all of that and making sure that they're big enough and they're going to be okay in a really open field, where they're going to get all kinds of sun and then, rain beating on them, that can take 6 to 8 weeks. But as soon as I see that the seed germinates and I know it's good, I feel comfortable selling it.
Thank you. That's helpful. Well, it occurred to me that if anybody has a plant that they'd really love to see seed for, this is your perfect opportunity to make a pitch to Sarah.
Yeah, we love suggestions. Yeah, and especially where we can find seed that we can wild collect, because that's obviously the best place to start. So I can see what it looks like. I can see where it likes to grow. If it's feasible to, everything won't be happy on our farm, even if it's an Alaskan plant. Obviously, Alaska is a huge place. So we often look for things that are happier in the interior or already are growing on the farm.
Well, it's nice that a lot of what you're growing it grow a lot of places.
Yes, that's that is one of the things that I check, obviously, like how big of a range is it, But then things like the Nootka lupin that I collected around Anchorage when I was living there, we started growing that, and the first year, like 2/3 of it winter killed in Fairbanks because it, was so cold. And I thought, well, I don't know if this is going to work, but it was such a beautiful plant and I just couldn't let it go. So we kept trying, and ultimately we just bred it out into plants that now have been bred and are consistently perennial. And they winter kill more than Arctic lupin does at that latitude, but not, it's an acceptable amount. They're mostly perennial. So sometimes we can do things like that too, where we breed.
There's a question about or maybe it's a suggestion about wild berries. So not quite sure about dry seed for berries.
Yeah, my oldest son loves berries and has like a little berry patch. He keeps pushing for more berry. He's almost scary to me because he runs around eating things in the woods a lot. But that's what farm boys are like in Alaska. So yeah, that may be the next generation. I'm still trying to figure out the flowers, but he's ready to jump onto berries. I don't know if any of your members are from the interior, but Ed Bostrom was our neighbor who grew all kinds of Alaskan berries for years and years and years. So it's funny for me to see my son wanting to do that more than flowers. He wants berries.
There is a question about whether you've considered cotton grasses at all.
I have not looked as much into that. No, that my dad just expanded again. We just planted a polar grass field to see if we could get back into that. So, part of our question is always like, is there going to be a market for it? And sometimes I'll look at a flower that I think is gorgeous and people will tell me it's a weed, or there's a lot less of a market that appreciates it for its diversity or for what it is. There are some flowers that I think that we grow that, like, one of my favorites is Jacob's Ladder. I think it's just a gorgeous little plant, and I think it's easy to grow for a new grower, and I really don't sell as much of that as I thought I would. Or even oxytrope, which is, a nitrogen fixer. I mean, there's all kinds of benefits to that plant. It's strange, the things that people find appealing versus not. But I mean, I like all of them. So
Yeah. No, there are lots of thank yous in the chat as well. Beth says, thank you for all of your hard work over so many years with many generations involved.
Sarah, I wanted to add that last year I had purchased some of your seeds at Mill and Feed here in Anchorage and sent those back to my mom and grandma. I know you're an alum from UNC.
yeah.
It's my hometown there in Greeley.
Oh,
So
really? That's funny.
some of your flowers are growing in Greeley too, at least as of if
Oh,
not
that's
already.
great. Oh,
They're
that's
in grandma's
wonderful.
garden back there. So I just want to let you know that was happening. So
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah. I have some friends here who have grown some of the Western Columbine. Actually does well outside of Alaska. We do have some for sale at Santa Claus House has some for sale as well, as kind of a take home a piece of Alaska, which I appreciate that they're trying to support, truly Alaska grown products. So hopefully, there's more of that market too. There's also Roaming Root in Fairbanks, which has only Alaska grown and Alaska produced objects, also carries our seed and has done really well with it. So I'm hoping that people will start I feel like there's been, part of what drew me to thinking that this would work at all was just the conversation about pollinators, concern about bees and bee species, and even, really kind of mainstream gardeners that were not really into, environmental discussions in Anchorage where we were doing our living during the winter at the time. We're talking about having issues with our gardens and having issues with pollinators. So I feel like this is a really low stress way to draw a lot more of that into your garden.
Sarah, I don't know if it fits with your growing conditions, but the Native Plants Society has a seed distribution every year, and we constantly cannot keep up with the demand for the wild poppies.
Oh, see, and yeah, that's another one that I haven't been able, if you could give me a little bit of it and I can propagate it, then I haven't been able to find it. And that's one of those that I'm really suspicious of when people tell me that they have, a true native poppy, because there's so much Asian poppy out there, that's invasive. So yeah, if I could get a little bit of it, and it's kind of what happened with the Columbine, the Western Columbine. I said to my friend Lubo at the PMC, I said, I'm just desperate to find some Western Columbine, but I need to know that it's the right stuff. And he gave me a very, small amount. And now it's, a huge piece of our field. And we produce, I think we had 15 pounds last year. So I just need a little bit. That would be great. Yeah, I would love to try to grow poppy, especially if I could really
Okay, we can talk about that.
Yeah, that would be great. And if anyone
Um,
can find some Myosotis alpestris, that would be fabulous. But it is hard.
yeah.
So if anyone has a source on that, I would love to know about it. I'm trying to think, there's been a couple flowers over time that I've really struggled with. That's been since the beginning. We couldn't find that one, but and the poppy is another one actually.
We do need to move on to our other speakers, but there was one last question here about whether you've approached any of the grocery stores, Cars or Freddy's, to see if they're interested at all in distributing your seed.
I haven't approached those specifically, but we've really not done well with any larger entities. It costs so much energy and the investment, and you saw some of those machines that are thousands and thousands of dollars, plus, we had to build another building to hold all the machines that I need for all these seeds. So the investment plus just how labor intensive it is, our wholesale prices are much higher than, what you can buy flower seed for. When I see dollar packets or $2 packets, that's not a sustainable business. And, you know, I love all the flowers just because I love being around them and I love the lifestyle of farming. But as my dad often reminds me, farming is a business and it has to pencil. And so that's part of what really needs to happen for us in the next, 3 to 5 years is this is still not there. We need more re-veg work. I need some more distributors for this to really be a financially viable thing the way that the grass seed has been.
Yeah, good to keep in mind. Well, on Sarah's website, which you see here, I know that there's a contact form. So if people have more questions or ideas for Sarah, that's a good place to continue the conversation. So yeah, I just want to repeat all the others who have stated already that this was a great talk, and we really appreciate you coming tonight, Sarah, and sharing about your operation.
Well,
And
please do
your
contact me anytime through the website. I love talking about flowers and native plants. I'm gonna have to sign off. It's very late where I am right here, but I really appreciate the invitation. So thank you for having me.